Due to various criticisms on YouTube, it stands worth repeating a certain few bullet points to put things in their place so that we don't have some kind of misunderstanding between us. The criticisms were something along the lines of you can't get current from the ground, or capacitive reactance does not produce energy, or go back to school and get some real training before you start talking like this on YouTube. Something along those lines. Well, here it is. I wrote the piece on Instructables.com, the shortcut of which is is.gd/make waves, plural waves, MAKEWAVES, for a reason. And so here I'm going to give you the short version so you don't have to read that long treatment of the subject. Free energy is a consequence. It's not a cause. It's an effect. Yet we want it, but you cannot do it. There's no way you can do it. But being that it's an effect and not a cause, then we go to its cause if we want that effect. The cause is we create waves, but we can also destroy them. It's not that easy as it sounds, but that's how we go about doing it. We create the wave, and the energy comes in and fills the void that wave would have been had it not been filled. And Mother Nature hates voids. So when she sees a wave begging for energy, she fills it with the energy that's available. Now, how much energy is available? Well, that depends on the valence electrons, their strength in holding together the materials of construction of a circuit. For instance, there's a certain valence charge that holds together the neighboring copper atoms in a piece of copper wire. If you exceed that for every single association or relationship between two neighboring copper atoms, not every other one, not every hundredth one, not every millionth pair, but every single one, if you exceed that, the thing blows up. The copper wire vaporizes. But if you don't exceed that value among all the associative pairs of copper atoms in that wire, it won't heat up. It won't vaporize, it won't blow up. These are the experiments that Tesla performed to see what the actual limit was in a circuit that he could take the circuit to, because he knew that free energy is limitless in theory. But in actuality, there is a limit, and has nothing to do with conservation law or this, that, and the other thing. It has to do with the valence charges that hold matter together, whether it's the valence charge between two neighboring atoms in the magnetic core of a transformer, or between the two neighboring atoms in the insulation that surrounds the copper wire, wherever that might happen to be within the circuit. Whatever it is, each pair has its own value, and it must not be exceeded for every single association between neighboring pairs. Now, that might not be totally accurate. It might be 10%, but it's not, going to be any value. In other words, there's wiggle room before the thing destroys itself. And up to that limit of wiggle room, that's how much we can put in the circuit. Now, if we increase the girth of the copper wire, we know that the resistance drops and we can supply more amps through that copper wire. We know that if we increase the farad value of a capacitor, in theory we can increase the amount of voltage that we can charge into it, but there's a limit to the fact that, there's an irony here, now it's the opposite. See, in coils everything is in conjunction, but in capacitors everything is in opposition. So when we raise the farads, we're not increasing the size of the coils, we're diminishing the thickness of the dielectric, which means it'll be easier and easier to poke holes through it as the voltage level can increase, because now it can theoretically hold more voltage. So Tesla liked mica for his dielectric because it was very sturdy, and you could get it nice and thin to increase the capacitance. But with capacitors, it's touch and go. It's very touchy, and yet oddly enough, capacitors are well, they're required in a circuit in which you have the two elements, capacitors and coils, in which you regulate the production or the creation, the production or the destruction of waves. The side effect of which is the appearance or disappearance of energy that is lively. Remember, when you've got an iron core, a magnetizable core to let's say a transformer, latent magnetism is there. Let's just take a non-magnetized piece of iron. The magnetism is latent there. It's just a question of orienting all of the little magnetic orientations, molecule by molecule or atom by atom within that core, so that they're oriented in the same direction to a certain degree, a certain percentage. So now we start to exhibit a magnetic field surrounding that iron core, magnetizable core. So the energy of magnetism was there, but we weren't making use of it because the orientation was all botched up. It was random. Well, it's the same situation in a piece of copper wire. If the copper atoms are acting in a way that a ripple wave is passing seemingly across the wire, and we're not going to get into that, well, that's a whole nother deal. The psychological imposition we place upon a piece of wire, thinking there's energy running down the wire when it's not. There's nothing running down the wire. It's a fiction. It's an illusion that our brain creates. Oh, we see a ripple wave and it looks like it's moving to the right, from left to right. It's no such thing. It's not moving left to right. It's moving up and down. But it's doing so atom by atom in such a way, in terms of timing, that it makes it creates the illusion of a wave rippling from left to right. It's just like moving pictures, not magnetic tape, DVDs, but moving picture film strip is 30 frames a second, all of them still images, and if you run it by the human eye fast enough, it looks like it's a one continuous motion. But if you slow it down, you can see they are individual images. It's the same problem in electrical dynamics. We think there's energy running down the wire, and there's no such deal. It's not exactly moving side to side either. It's the expansion and contraction of the electron shell of each atom, but it's done in such a means of timing sequence that it makes it look like there's a ripple of energy running down the wire, when in fact there's no such animal taking place. So we've got all kinds of silly notions that are erroneous, and that's just one. But the other is that free energy is an effect, it's not a cause. And up to the limit that the copper valence charges of that copper wire can withstand, just taking copper as an example, all we do is manufacture waves from the waves that are already there. You can't make waves from no waves. That's what it boils down to. But you can clone a wave from another wave, and we know this because all you need is all the blank CDs in the world, and you can make so many clones of your music files and spread them to all the people in your school if you want to, for the cost of a stack of 100 blank CDs and the cost of the electricity to run your computer. But the actual cloning process is zero cost because you're simply cloning information, and that's what a wave is. It's an analog format of information, while the CD is digital format, but it's still just information. You're cloning information, and the materials of construction of the blank CD provide all the rest to fill in that information and give it an embodiment, so that the ones and zeros have somewhere to be burned into a blank CD that you can now pass to your friends. But the wave, the information itself is free. It's the embodiment, the matter, energy, matter. It's the embodiment that costs. So yeah, it costs money to go out and buy 200 pounds of enameled magnetic wire. It costs money to go buy a laminate. It costs a great deal of money to buy go buy a laminate iron core for a transformer winding. These things are the costs, yet they don't get consumed And this is the problem we have with our picture of reality of the consumption of electrical energy. We think it's just like a bonfire. You have to keep feeding it wood. It's not the same. The wood gets consumed, yeah, because it gets converted. But the copper wire doesn't get converted. It's still sitting there for reuse and reuse. And how come we don't reuse the electrical energy? The very first default circuit I have at vinyasi.info/N as in Nebraska, E as in Edward, the first two letters of negative resistance. vinyasi.info/NE. The default circuit is Paul Falstad's circuit, power factor 2 .txt. But I realized in looking at that circuit there's more going on there than just a power factor. It's the ability to use a capacitor between your load and the AC source, an inductive load and an AC source with a little few resistances in between. And with the help of that capacitor you can recycle 99% of the electricity used by that inductive load. And it only costs you at the AC source 1% of what that inductive load is using. This is the simplest form of free energy, is conservation by way of recycling. And it just takes a capacitor, 1.4 microfarads in between. It's amazing. It's incredible how we fail to see the reality of free energy in so many different ways that we can do it. We can turn down the thermostat in our home. That's free energy. Energy we don't have to spend because we've now turned down the thermostat. We've now injected soy-based foam insulation between the studs of our exterior walls that previously had no insulation whatsoever, like this building I'm sitting in. And now we get to save money on our electric bill and on our propane bill. The easiest way to create free energy. No criticisms from anybody, right? Well, I do the same thing when I create a circuit based on Eric Dollard's module, LMD analog computer. I lower the inductance on the coil. That's the first step, because the back EMF is the easiest way to offer resistance to an endeavor of producing free energy. It's the easiest way to offer resistance and make it difficult, if not impossible, to generate more from less. Not something from nothing. More from less, because we're cloning waves. And in the case of the simulator, we can go to infinity because there are no materials of construction. There is no gauge of wire. It's infinite gauge. It's a superconductor. So I can get away with certain things in the simulator, but the thesis, the concept, remains the same. As to real life, it's just a little harder to manifest in real life because there's so many imperfections that we have to learn the tricks to, though. You don't use brute force. You learn what the tricks are. You know? Donald Smith talked about them. And it's right there in the pole transformer outside our building. The secondary has a counter winding on the secondary. A center tap, and each side of the secondary is counter wound with respect to the other. It's, you know, these kind of tricks help improve efficiency to achieve your goal. But that has nothing to do with the free energy concept. The concept is the production of waves. Eric Dollar doesn't talk about it this way, but this has been my training that the simulation environment has trained my brain to think in terms of, because the simulator has infinite energy available to it. So that can't be the factor that turns a simulation into a tank circuit or a dead circuit or a free energy circuit. That can't be the limiting factor. It's got to be something else. And the only other factor besides energy is the wave that embodies that energy. That structure of that energy is the wave. And if you don't study wave mechanics in the field of optics, before you take electrical engineering, you're not going to know what I'm talking about, and you're going, you know, because you don't understand they don't teach electrical engineers everything there is to know, essentially, about wave mechanics that you need to know if you want to create free energy instead of just bad-mouthing what you don't understand. You have to go back to school and study wave mechanics in the field of optics and stop bitching what I'm doing or saying. I don't say anything wrong. I just don't say it as good as it could be said, and that gets better with time because I have a more fuller understanding over time. But essentially everything I've said is true over the time. It's just that we have to lose some of the strange vernacular and the strange concepts that we've been taught are valid because we've been given a narrow tunnel vision of the entire reality of electrodynamics. We all talk about mass is equal to energy times the square of the speed of light, Forget that. It's so bogus. It has nothing to do with electrical energy. It has everything to do with nuclear bombs. They have to do that equation to figure out how much mass of plutonium to put in there to create how much energy of explosion of a nuclear reaction. It has nothing to do with electrical engineering whatsoever. It's absurd to think that it does. Unless, no, it still is absurd, because the only limit is the valence strength of the bonds in the materials of construction of the circuit, and that's far less than the amount of energy available in E equals mc squared. Far less. But it's still a lot more than what's being supplied by the AC power plant running into our home or the battery pack in our EV. It's still far greater, just considering the valence strengths of the copper winding in our EV motor. That's still a lot of wiggle room. Far more energy than we'll ever need to power that EV motor driving that EV. Still, it's pretty good. So now, if all it is the manufacture of waves from pre-existing waves, before the wave dies out, when the energy, vacates the circuit, before that happens, we still have a wave. It's like an ember. And from an ember, this here is the only time a bonfire analogy is appropriate. From an ember, you can properly build up that ember to become another bonfire, provided you haven't entirely lost all the thermal energy of a bonfire, in the sense that you've lost all your embers. If you still have one ember, you can start another bonfire. And it's the same way with electrical energy. If you have even a minuscule wave still lively, still vibrating within the circuit, you can turn that into such a raging fire of electricity, you'll burn up your circuit and melt the insulation and yada yada yada. But it's all about the wave. It has nothing to do with energy. And the only matter is the matter of the circuit that matters, and the valence strengths of the materials of construction of that circuit. Far more energy there still than the battery pack. Okay, I'm repeating myself. So we have to consider this in the right way. And as it is, a wave is a delusion, as it is, because no energy travels down the wire. It does not happen. If there's any wave that travels at all, it's in the space between the atoms of the copper wire. That's the only wave that travels. And it doesn't travel in space. God forbid it should, because then all of physics would be turned upside down. No, it travels in counter space. You ever hear about a physicist talking about counter space? The laws of physics that have to do with counter space? Show me. They're not going to be the same as the laws of space physics. It's going to be completely different. It's going to be an Alice in Wonderland turnaround image of reality. It's not the same. It's completely turned around. Inverted, different, non-predictable. You just have to go there and bumble around and find out and infer, because you'll never see it. You'll never sense it. You'll never measure it. Yet there are anomalous circumstances, and if you keep shoving them aside and saying, then you'll never know what you're missing. If you can't define anomalies in a way, well, see, here's the problem. It goes beyond that. It goes predecessor to that. Before you can describe an anomaly, you have to duplicate successfully some of the experiments of Eric Dollard. Instead of saying it can't be done, and this is why. No, you have to do it successfully before you can even explain it away. And how many of you are going to bother to do that? You know? I can do it in the simulator. It's easy because the simulator is a tunnel vision of reality. But being a tunnel vision, it is not delusional for me to think that the simulator has no validity or that the simulator lies. There's no such animal as a lying simulator. You know, in statistics, graphs don't lie. It's the interpretation that might skew your vision. But even the interpretation does not lie. Unless what the speaker says and what the listener hears are two different things. That's not a lie. That's just miscommunication. Simulators and graphs do not lie. They are data. But if they don't give a full picture of reality, and they're not, statistics usually don't, and neither does the simulator, that's different. Then we have to figure that into the equation of reality. But it's not a lie, and it's not a misrepresentation whatsoever. Unless you watch cartoons and you see Bugs Bunny leap off a building and you think you can too. But Bugs Bunny is a simulation, right? That's all it is a simulation. It's a tunnel vision of reality that works in the cartoon land, in Toonland, because it's tunnel vision. It's not taking everything into account. But it does take a few things into account that are true, out of context to the reality of the greater truth, which is a composition of more truths in addition to the truth of the Bugs Bunny cartoon. I think that covers most everything, but I really, you know, once in a while I keep hearing these, and obviously I've put up so many videos, there's no way the critic can see them all. So it stands worth repeating. Here we are. I'm repeating a thought that needs to be repeated. A wave is an illusion as it is, because it's our brain fooling us that there's any movement taking place. And the energy is in the materials of construction of the circuit, including the battery pack, but the energy stays in one place. It doesn't move anywhere. And the movement of a wave is an illusion. There's no movement throughout the circuit. Yet, for convenience sake, we talk as if there's energy moving. We talk as if the amperage is oriented such that it's leaving one place or entering another. It's so bogus. There's no such animal. There's no such thing as amperage or current, leaving somewhere or going going somewhere. There's no such animal. It does not exist. But until we look at things correctly, we're going to keep screwing it up and criticizing what we are misrepresenting. You know, if you don't ask the right question, you can't solve it. And a criticism, more often than not, is based on a non-valid way of looking at the situation. If you looked at it correctly, you wouldn't criticize it. You'd simply describe it. That's all. You would simply describe it and leave your opinion to yourself, because opinions are always summations of facts, extracted from the facts as an abstraction, which can only be done by taking the summation or the conclusion or the opinion or the criticism out of context. But if you do it one layer removed, that's okay, you can get away with it. But the way things are taught in school these days, we're taught as much opinion, if not more so, than the facts. And a lot of facts are left out of the picture. And so our opinions are skewed based on faulty data. Now, when I was having experiences as a teenager of God consciousness, there are several stages to the formation of an opinion, and every stage has to be met or else you will never have an accurate opinion. But the underlying limitation of opinions is you can only do an opinion one step removed from the facts. If you make an opinion of an opinion, the secondary opinion and all the following tertiary and quaternary opinions are false, because you are basing them on incomplete data. An opinion in itself is incomplete data. There is no way you can treat that as data, as reality. It's an illusion to think so. An opinion is an illusion if you take it to be equivalent to reality. It's an opinion, an abstraction from the data of reality, and as such, it is incomplete and always will be, as an opinion. But to be highly accurate, you have to have all the facts. So how do you get all the facts? You start with your senses, your observation. That includes meters, but your senses cannot tell you everything. And when it comes to electrical engineering, they cannot tell you what's going on in counter space any more than an imaginary number can be seen, touched, tasted, felt, or smelled, or heard. They are inferred from various mathematical problems that cannot be solved otherwise without them. And they are called imaginary for a reason, because they are inferred. They are imagined. Yet, a lot of electrical engineering would fall flat on its face if not for the existence of complex numbers, or imaginary numbers for that matter. Like that, our senses cannot tell us everything. And what makes up the difference? Well, the first stage is memory. We go to memory to see if it can fill in some of the gaps, and it usually can. If we have any experience whatsoever in the matter. But memory will always fall short. Trust me. Everything you've been taught in school is not going to be enough, even if you had perfect memory of everything you've learned in school, read from books, heard people talk about. It'll never be enough. Your memory will be incomplete. And that's only if you have perfect memory anyway, as it is. But it'll still be incomplete. There's a third stage to gathering data, and that's intuition, imagination, inspiration. It's all one and the same. It's 3 in 1, 1 in 3. It's just 3 different ways of looking at the same function of the mind. Your intuition literally has to be clairvoyant in order to fill in all the gaps left by memory. And only then, when you have that triple layer process, because intuition will never bother doing any work for you on your behalf if you don't follow the steps of procedure and go to your senses first. And memory will never bother to fill in the gaps of your faulty observations unless you first go and take the first step and bother to observe. So it's very sequentially sequenced, but it's 3 steps or 3 layers of stepping through data gathering. And only when you go through all 3 steps and there's wiggle room, there's mercy with faulty observation, incomplete observation, faulty observation, incomplete or faulty memory, provided you are perfectly clairvoyant, and only saints have perfect clairvoyance. And only if they put their attention on the subject. Only the Almighty puts his attention, or its attention, if you prefer, her attention, on all subjects simultaneously, such that that is perfect clairvoyance. But for human beings, we can have a taste of perfect clairvoyance, one subject at a time, whatever our attention is on. That we are potentially capable of having perfect clairvoyance. But usually only saints. Now, there is a loophole in that, and that is only for people who have reached the 7th heaven in their prior intertime phase between the last incarnation and the current one. And then they come into the current incarnation with that ability to read a carbon copy, a courtesy copy of the Akashic records in the 7th subplane of the heavenly plane. Because normally only saints can have access to the Akashic records because it's located in Akasha, and only saints have a space body, a body of space, a body of Akasha. But there is a loophole, and it's very rare that human beings reach the seventh heaven. It normally doesn't happen. They usually, even before their next incarnation, when they become a saint, they usually only make it to the fifth heaven. They don't even reach the sixth, usually. So to reach the seventh is quite rare. But as it is, on top of that, you have to have a fully functional nervous system. Your physiology can't crap out on you, or else you're not going to have access to whatever clairvoyant gifts or whatever, your IQ gifts that you were, born with. You're not going to have access to them unless your body supports your mind. So there are all kinds of ways. See, this is why reality is a little more complicated than this world of the simulator, because there's so many other factors involved. Still, despite that, in order to have a correct opinion on any subject, you have to go through all the steps. And the last one has to make up for the imperfection of the prior two. The last one, the intuition, has to make up for the imperfection of memory and the imperfection of the senses. But data gathering has to be complete, or else any opinion is going to be faulty. Just the first one. And then you have to stop right there and not make an opinion of an opinion, because then that secondary opinion is false. By default, there is no way it can be true. It's always going to be false, because it's based on incomplete data. Any opinion gathered from the most perfect source of data is always going to be incomplete, because it's an abstraction from the data, which means it's a narrow focus. It's a tunnel vision of the entire picture. It's a summation. That's what summations are. How do you take something complex with lots of data and boil it down to a summation? You leave out stuff, and you just highlight certain important points. But what points do you pick? That's your choice. Just like a statistician will graph something and skew the graph by leaving out data in his graph and foster one opinion over another. Well, like that, an opinion is already skewed by default. It's already incomplete and has to be only interpreted correctly if you have access to the data that formed that opinion in the first place. And then and only then can you understand the opinion in its utter truthfulness, its utter accuracy, if you have access to all the data that went to forming that opinion. Well, I did the work. I don't go back to school. I go back to the simulator. I go back to Eric Dollard. Because between those two sources of information, I pretty much have everything I need. And if I don't have it currently, all I have to do is go back to either one of those two sources or both to get more data, to get more knowledge, to be able to form more opinions. It's really easy and simple. It's not easy, it's simple. Because it always requires work and the time spent doing the work. But most of the time is spent on the simulator, because that's my substitute for what Eric Dollard has done on the bench. He's done it in the real world, and I have to do it in the world of the simulator using the tools that he provides us. He tells us it's really simple. Coils and caps. How more complicated can it get? It can't. You just play around with it until you start to get results. And it took me a little while. I didn't get it right away. And in the world of the simulator, you'll get it faster than in the real world, because you can burn up more circuits, you can waste more time doing circuits that don't result in anything until you finally get it right. Until you finally understand the relationship between capacitance and inductance and get over unity. Draining the source faster then all your components are utilizing that energy, but that's a minor problem. That's a secondary problem. That has nothing to do with creation of free energy. That just means you're tied to the source continually, thinking you need to, like any flashlight circuit, like any conventional circuit. And with free energy, you don't need to do that, so why bother doing it and running up the amperage cost on your voltage source when you can cut that out of the circuit and let the circuit self-run. It may run itself down because you haven't learned how to take the pre-existing waves and clone more waves, and thus, by effectually create more energy, and call that free energy as the icing on the cake. You still have to bake the cake first, and that is clone waves. Xerox them, call it what you will, create them, but you're not creating them from flat baseline. That's impossible. I don't know how to do that. But if you've got a little bit of a wave, you can make more out of it. So long as your circuit is a little bit lively, you can make it more lively, or you can make it less lively. And this has nothing to do with thermodynamic losses or thermodynamic conversions. That's something else. And that's a one-way ticket to entropy. This has to do with something else, and you just have to study Eric Dollard and stop bitching about him being not the kind of electrical engineer that is your ideal. He is the ideal. Trust me. He's my role model, and if I have failed, it's because I've failed to pattern myself completely off of him, which I know I have, and I know I will. But he is my role model. And it also doesn't mean I'm doing anything that he would approve of. Regardless, he's my role model. Always has been, with regard to all of these simulations and all of the opinions that these simulations have generated. Because that's all I focus on is the LMD analog computer. It's not interesting to focus on anything else for me, unless it's just for entertainment purposes, to inspire me to continue on with what I do, but not try to do what anybody else does. I don't need to. I don't want to. And it's hard enough as it is just to focus on one concept and learn all of its variations, let alone try to learn a whole new concept and deal with that. I'm no Tesla, I'm no, whatever, people who can reinvent their research into other areas. I can't do that. When it comes to electrical engineering, it's complicated enough as it is. It's hard enough as it is to understand and wrap my mind around it. So I keep myself to just one task and one task alone, and that's understand the LMD analog computer as best I can, trying to exceed what I've already done, if I can. And I can't force it. I can't say today I'm going to exceed myself. It won't happen that way, because I have to use my intuition. I have to use my gut instinct. I have to use my prior memory of prior experience. I have to use the observation of what the simulator is presenting to me. I have to use the memory of what Eric has said, If I read about anybody else, it's always in the context of what Eric has to say about the matter. Otherwise, I'll have no reference to judge what other people say. And if there's any kind of similitude, then I can make sense of what other people say. Otherwise, I can't, and I have to just set it aside and say, well, look, maybe someday I'll understand what that person's talking about. But in the meantime, I don't. But if I do, then I have to, make a video like I'm doing now as a compliment to what the critics are saying, to try to fill in the gaps. Because the criticism by itself is bogus because it's missing things, very weighty chunks. And I'm merely trying to fill in the gaps so that the criticism is no longer a criticism. It's just stating such a narrow view that you can get away with thinking it's a criticism. But it's no fault of mine. It's a fault of the viewpoint of the critic is so overly narrow, the person is leaving out very important chunks of information that would have prevented the criticism as being a criticism. Instead, it would simply be an attempt to fill in my gaps, but not undermine anything that I've said, because what I've said is based on my observation of what I know to be true. But everything I've said just now, a lot of it, is inferred from other information that we know about perception, human perception. How much we can fool ourselves into thinking that a wave moves or that energy moves. You know, you just can't criticize one thing. You've got to criticize all of it and have a basis for each criticism, because it's a composition of perspective in which all the parts have to be there for the composition to make any sense at all. And if you take anything out of context, you've already blown it. You've already blown it. But in our age of overly specialized learning, it's very easy to get a wrong view of the subject in question. You really pretty much have to be interdisciplinary if you want an accurate view of your subject in question. You don't have to learn about everything. You don't have to learn about football in order to understand about electrodynamics, but you do have to take up wave mechanics, particularly in the field of optics, if you're going to understand the wave mechanics of electrical dynamics. Otherwise, you've already blown it right there. Unless you've got a background, a feel for wave mechanics as it is. You've blown it already if you don't have that feeling for wave mechanics. And that's, I think, why Paul Falstad's electronic simulator is ahead above all the others, because he is very good at wave mechanics. He's famous for his ripple tank, and that's just one example. But he knows how to think in terms of a wave before he even gets to electrical theory. You really have to look at it with the other side of your brain before you get to the intellectual side and start measuring amps and volts and things like that, because that's breaking things down. You have to look at the whole picture, and the whole picture is a wave, and that's using the other side of your brain, the Gestalt side, not the intellectual side, not the side having to do with speech, but the side having to do with forms, shapes, geometries, timing, in addition to, not taken by itself. I'm doing the best I can by trying to help you learn what I've learned. But there's only so much I can convey with speech. And that in itself, that means of conveyance, is already a failure. And it has nothing to do with me. It's just the medium of communication is a failure. That we choose to communicate using words and concepts. But that's not how I learned this. But that's how it's taught in school. Because they don't teach you wave mechanics, particularly in the field of optics, if you're going to study electrical engineering. You've got to know optical wave mechanics before you can study electrical engineering. But hey, you know, don't take my word for it. Just keep barking up your tree, if that's your game. Keep barking away. You know, it's like the dogs I pass, the neighborhood dogs. Some are friendly, some are not, but they all bark. And it almost doesn't matter whether they're friendly or vicious. They just bark. You know, woof, 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 you know. They gotta bark. That's why they were hired, to patrol the property and bark. Some are getting on in years. They bark twice, and then and then they leave you alone. But they bark, you know. What can you do? You keep walking. That's what you do. You keep walking. And that's what I do. I keep moving. It doesn't stop me what I do. I've learned not to take criticisms too seriously. It would be impossible to get any information out of a criticism to be absolutely worthwhile. There's always a limit to how much information, to how much good it can do. And it varies, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But it's never perfect. Ultimately, as I've said before recently, all knowledge has to come from the self. It does not come from somebody else. Because if it cannot come from yourself, you do not own the knowledge. You're just borrowing it. You're a borrowed ladder. You got to see the movie Gattaca with Ethan Hawke and Jude Law, and Uma Thurman, and a few other notable, Alan Arkin, Lauren Dern, no. Oh God, no, Lauren is his last name. Dean Lauren, I think, is his name. Gore Vidal. That movie is all about a borrowed ladder. But ultimately, it has to come from yourself. Or else you are just a borrowed ladder. That's all you are. And I can say from experience what I've seen happen in the simulator, and the rest is inference. But hey, I've seen it happen. And it's not a lie. It may be anomalous, but that just means we don't know how to explain it yet. But that's so secondary, the ability to explain something. And as it is, it's already an opinion because it's using the wrong side of the brain. The only way to really learn it is to present a wave in front of somebody's face and ask them, okay, what's going on? It's like the PMH, the perpetual motion holder. It's been 5 years since it was shown to me in front of my face by Paul Babcock and a few other electrical engineers and physicists, and none of us could explain it. Now I can. It's very easy, because Eric Dollard already has. It's magnetism devoid of electrostatics, which means it has nothing to do with electricity. It's not electrical, even though electricity put it in there, and when it comes out, it's an electrical phenomenon. But when it's going around and around in a circle in that toroidal magnetizable iron shape, it goes on for an indefinite length of time, does not lose its power because it's not electricity. It's magnetism, pure magnetism devoid of electrostatics, which means it has nothing to do with electricity. Because you have to have magnetism, electrostatics, and time to synthesize electricity. So it can't have electrostatics. There's no voltage there. It's 0 volts. It's just pure amps. If you could imagine such a thing, that's what it is. Pure amps. That's why nobody can get anything useful out of a perpetual motion holder, because it's a one-shot deal. It's a one-shot wonder. You've extracted all the magnetism. Unless you use that iron core in a coordinated fashion along with a capacitor, and you keep the coil around that core. Now you've got both the synthesis and the decomposition of electricity happening at the same time, or happening in the same circuit, not necessarily at the same time, in the same component, to one degree or another, so that the net result will either be the circuit will run down, not necessarily because of thermodynamic conversion and losses, or run up to over unity. I think I've said enough.